Jason Glickman, PG&E's Executive Vice President of Engineering, Planning, and Strategy. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, John, thanks for having me today.
Of course. I've been looking forward to doing this story and having a conversation about this for a while because, as we all know, you can't go more than a few seconds in an energy industry conversation without data centers coming up.
Yeah.
It seems like there is an unbelievable amount of rhetoric surrounding this topic, specifically, can the grid keep up? Or all these data centers are going to wreck the grid, both in terms of like reliability and capacity, and how are we going to deal with these extremely large loads that are trying to interconnect very, very quickly? So the goal of this conversation, and some that will follow, is to bring at least a little bit of a reality check to here's what utilities working on this issue actually think about this changing dynamic and how it impacts their operations and their broader customer base. Jason, before we get into all that, can you give just a brief rundown of your background and your current role at PG&E?
Yeah, happy to, John. So I joined PG&E as part of the new team with Patty a little over 3 years ago. So mid 2021. I've lived in Northern Central California, the Bay Area, for pretty much my whole adult life, 25 plus years. So I've been a PG&E customer for a long time. My role at PG&E is really engineering, planning, and strategy. It's somewhat of a unique function in the industry, though I think some others are moving towards it. It's effectively, if you think about everything that needs to happen upstream of construction and operations in the field, so line workers in a bucket truck or gas crews working a trench, everything that needs to happen to get that job ready, whether it's design, engineering design, permitting, fleet, materials, aviation assets if we need them, all of that is under our shop. And so we really think about our role as being accountable to making sure that our teams and coworkers out there in the field working with customers have what they need to get the job done safely at the right place at the right time. That's kind of a critical component. And then we also have a whole host of functions around innovation, our energy procurement team, our strategy team. And so really the whole idea, we have a mission statement for our team that's we take action every day to revolutionize Californians' energy future. And that we kind of live in these multiple time zones, as we like to put it, where, we could be focused on making sure we get a permit or a design out the door today to go build that, resilient and clean infrastructure that's going to serve customers long into the future. So, it's a real privilege. I love the team and our capability. Before joining PG&E, I spent about 15 years with Bain & Company, a global consulting firm. And the last 5 years or so that I was there, I led the utilities and renewables practice in the Americas and globally. So, I had the privilege to work with utilities all over the country in particular. And it was, as I say, the opportunity to come focus in my backyard and really try and make a difference and serve in California is what drew me to PG&E.
Awesome. And that kind of cross-cutting appeal to your role is really helpful to this conversation because I think there are a number of different tentacles connected to that topic of data centers. It's system planning and grid mod, it's grid ops, it's customer engagement and interconnection, resource adequacy. And there's so many things funneling into this that you're right. I think a lot of utilities historically have been very siloed, and you have your role and you do your one thing. You're on vegetation management or you're on wildfires, and that's what you do. And anymore, all of these different things kind of funnel up into this singular challenge of like, how do we make this giant system work and be reliable and safe? So give us a snapshot of how PG&E views this data center load growth story. Patty Poppy's addressed it in a number of recent investor calls that there is clearly significant demand in the queue. Data centers want to connect as fast as possible with as much power as possible. And that's a challenge. So, given that broader rhetoric that I mentioned earlier of that utilities can't keep up, how do you guys view it internally? And what does the dynamic look like for PG&E's system?
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think, John, you're right. We have been talking about this externally, including I had the chance, along with Patty and our CFO, Carolyn Burke, and others on our team, to share, some of our perspectives at our mid-June investor event in New York. I'd encourage folks to go take a look at that as well. You can find the recording on our IR site. But I think it's important, and I'll get to the specifics how we think about data centers, but I also think it's important to kind of think about the macro context that we're having this conversation in. For the industry, and absolutely as the case in California, the opportunity for expansive load growth is a complete paradigm shift from where we've been. I like to say that we're in California in particular, we're talking about a policy and regulatory and customer behavior paradigm that has actually had a goal to destroy demand for electricity. I don't use that verb lightly. I mean, that's been the objective, right? To steadily, crank out 1% to 1.5% or 2% of energy efficiency every single year for decades. And so now in the last really 5 years, 5 or 6 years at most, and really you could say the last 2 or 3, to have this paradigm shift where now our objective is to grow electric load as fast as we can and shift this whole machine, right? This whole machine from an engineering perspective, a construction perspective, a customer engagement perspective, regulatory cost recovery perspective, how we forecast load. I think it's and I raised that, again, I'll get to the specifics on data centers in a second, but I don't think you can have the data center conversation without that broader context. Because we've had a paradigm that's not been set up explicitly for growth, I think in a lot of jurisdictions, in particular in California. So there's that broader backdrop that's on our minds. We would say, look, the demand is real. We shared that we had, multiple gigawatts of data center applications in our pipeline. Some predating, there's some natural data center demand that we tend to see in our service area naturally, year on year. But then we've obviously seen this big uptick. We saw this, 3x increase in demand early in the late part of 2023, early part of 2024 relative to our typical demand for applications. And as we saw that uptick and we saw some what was going on around the industry, we decided to initiate what we called a cluster study, where we actually solicited out to to our customer base and our partners and to the industry broadly to say, let us know what your interest is, over the next 5 years in terms of interconnecting in our service area for data center load. And in particular, in the Bay Area and the South Bay in particular, San Jose, Fremont, kind of the broader Silicon Valley area, which has been a historical hotspot for data center locations for many years. I think it's kind of sometimes lost on folks. It's easy to get trapped, and trapped in the, California is expensive and, per kWh rates and you can't build, et cetera, et cetera. The Bay Area has been a top 10 data center market, for a long time. And if you kind of put DC and Northern Virginia to the side for a second, which is unique in many, many ways. And I have both empathy and respect and a whole bunch of other emotions for our friends at Dominion. It's right there neck and neck as one of the top markets. So we said, we know there's going to be demand. We did this cluster study, and in total, we found that we had a pipeline of about 3.5 gigawatts of data centers that we're looking to interconnect, within call it a 5-year period. Depends on the application. And the reason, John, we did that was the traditional planning model has been, I get one application, particularly these are transmission level loads. I go look at all the ripple effects from a network perspective and where do I need substation upgrades and whatnot, and do I have the energy from a generation perspective? And you give it a yes, a no, or a maybe, effectively. And then the next application comes in, and then the third one, and all of a sudden you've got a bunch of both electrical and land use and other challenges. And so we said, let's take a look at this holistically all at once. And so we're not yet through that process, but what I can say is that type of engagement has definitely made clear to us that a significant portion of that 3.5 gigawatts in the pipeline is very real demand. It's very real demand. Now I will say, and then I'll pause. We're very cognizant, again, because we've had a good history with data centers, not at this scale, that we understand that there's some land grab, both literally and figuratively, in the industry, and that's been the model, right? You're trying to get online and then get your hosting capacity there, and then sign up customers, right? So we understand there's some natural attrition, and we plan for that. But even notwithstanding that, we're seeing, as I say, a healthy chunk of that 3.5 gigawatts looking like it wants to come and build.
Everything you are describing about data centers is the same story arc that we experienced with renewables. Every single piece, the speculation and the significant demand and needing to progress from serial to cluster studies. I see utilities adapting to these interconnection requests in a very similar way to utility scale generation projects, solar, wind, and batteries. So it is kind of an interesting parallel there. And you mentioned serving Silicon Valley. So I think PG&E is as good as any utility to be weighing in on this, including Dominion, because you serve not only that epicenter of technology and innovation, but you're hosting those data centers locally. And even for the projects that don't end up on your system, Microsoft is right down the street. Meta is right down the street. X is right down, So I think you're able to engage with these partners in maybe a different and more intimate way than other utilities are, just due to geography and proximity. And this would be the time to subtly plug. DISTRIBUTECH is presenting PG&E's Innovation Summit on November 13th. So by the time this comes out, registration may already be open. It is going to be free, so do check that out. Data centers, AI are going to be all over the place, and I'll be there as well. Jason, Patty, in her public comments, Patty Poppe, your CEO, has framed this, at least by my calculation, as being an opportunity and not so much a headwind and a threat to utilities. Everyone else outside of utilities wants to talk about how this is a threat to the grid. She says, investors, look, all these people want electricity from us. We can supply that electricity. We make money from electricity. That seems like a much more optimistic view than I've heard from others.
Yeah, we are optimistic. I mean, I think, when we look out over the next 20 years, and into the early 2040s, into the time frame, where both state policy and then our own net zero, plans and objectives and goals come into play. We're looking at least 70% growth in electric load. And, I think you have to go back to at least the, post World War II and kind of rural electrification era to find anything resembling that type of growth. And so, I tell our team, and there's a shift from, this kind of mode we've been in, I think as an industry and as PG&E to a growth oriented mode. But how many businesses would be delighted to know that you've got visibility to a near doubling of demand over a couple decades? What an absolute blessing and privilege. And I think for us, the part of that that's most exciting is when we look at that kind of end game. You look at for our customers, whether those are large commercial, industrial customers, and particularly our residential customers. There's a future there where they're not only have climate resilient infrastructure that's reliable in the face of increasingly extreme weather, and I want to come back to that in a minute around is the grid ready, is the grid falling down and whatnot. But it can be less expensive and a better customer experience. Our analysis, and others have looked at this, would say the average customer household energy spend can be 20 to 25 or 30% lower in real terms than it is today, because you're not spending on gasoline, you're spending, you're shifting all that spend on gasoline and in particular into the electric system. So this load growth and the opportunity to take this giant machine and asset and grow load and spread the fixed cost out over much more demand and much more units will reduce the unit cost of electricity, will make it more affordable. You combine that with the inherent efficiency of electric machines versus other machines, and it's a really compelling future. We've got a grid, and I would say we, PG&E, but I would imagine this math holds in other areas, that if you just do simple math of the average day versus the peak day is 45% utilized. And we think you could go, in the future with electric vehicle load, with the right type of customer-friendly building electrification, with data center and other industrial demand, that you could increase that to more like, 65, 70, 70% plus on average. So that's something we're really excited about. Patty's an industrial engineer by training. I'm an industrial engineer by training. So we get really excited about that type of system level optimization. So that's the big backdrop for us why we're excited. Now, the thing I will say on data centers in particular that is interesting is, we see an opportunity there to grow load in a manner that is beneficial to prosperity, right, for our service area in terms of, data centers aren't massive employers, but they are employers. They provide tax base. They create an ecosystem around them. And we think that we can actually grow that data center load in a manner that is beneficial to the system as a whole. We are not going to go after data center or other large industrial and commercial demand in a manner that we will only do it in a manner that makes things more affordable for the whole, right? That helps support that rising tide of growing load and spreading load over a larger base and reducing unit costs. So that's why we're optimists overall about the opportunity, I would say, John.
Okay, that's great, because I was going to go there next, and it's kind of a two-part question. One, how do you go at this? And you answered it in part with the cluster study approach, but how do you go at this from a system planning and grid modernization standpoint of what you need to meet the needs of those large loads, to get them interconnected and then manage those assets? We hear so frequently about the flexibility of data centers. Are they truly flexible once turned on, or do they have this kind of 24/7 thirst for power? And then I guess the kind of the back end of all of that is that cost shift. How do you make sure that there isn't a shift of upgrade costs onto your broader customer base to not disenfranchise those existing customers who are within your territory? So we can kind of take that piece by piece, but I'm interested that the system planning aspect, getting them online. We know, I think nationally, the average is about 36 months from application to COD for a lot of these data centers, and 3 years is a long time for these customers. Yeah. So what do you need to get them online, and how are you going to approach that at this scale?
Yeah, well, one thing I will say, there's a bunch in that, a number of questions. One thing we've found through the cluster study process, and we've seen this with data center loads and other loads, is that when we engage in I'll call it a consultative manner, getting their engineering team and our engineering teams together, that's also part of the paradigm shift. And you talk about some of a Meta or a Microsoft or Amazon or you name it, right? In terms of the big tech players who are data center owners and the hyperscalers. But really across the board, the level of sophistication of our large customers in terms of their energy engineering has grown by leaps and bounds over the last, decade. And so we can come to the table together and have a real conversation about their needs that are different, I think, than we were able to have in the past. I think in the past it was very kind of firewalled, send in an application, the utility studies it, spits out an answer. Like kind of old school arm's length. we're working to be much more, as you said, partnership oriented. And as we've done that, one of the things that we can explore is, well, if you're trying to put on 99 megawatts of load, and we'll come back to why 99 is the magic number, has been the magic number in California. Do you need all 99 right away? Or does your commercial ramp up and your project economics make it look such that, scaling 20, 50, 80, 100 would work for you? And not, I wouldn't say, all the time, but frequently it's the case that there's a ramp up in the project or in the project's commercial roadmap such that we can think about how we match up our infrastructure build to that. So that's one thing that's really important. I think another thing that's really important in that consultative process is being able to have a give and take about, well, I know you initially applied and you wanted to be right here on this postage stamp, of land and on our system, but what about these 3 other sites that are within a 10-mile radius? Would any of those work for you? And again, that's something that I think for various reasons, both the utilities and our counterparts and our customer partners have not historically engaged in. And we're trying to really foster more of that dialogue to say, hey, look, let's get creative and work together to find spots where we can get you on the system. Because it's not the case. I mean, when you look at even just the system average data I was just mentioning, it's just not the case that the grid is overloaded everywhere. The grid is overloaded at some spots on some days. And so that's a really important give and take around both that schedule and location. Another element to your point in terms of the economics and making it work, these data centers are all transmission level connections and loads, and creating a standard tariff, John, that works for those data center customers, works for our economics, works for all customers is really important. So that we don't have to go back to our regulators on a one-off basis each time with each particular arrangement. That will help our speed tremendously, and it'll help us make sure we've got the cost allocation right. I think there's been, we've seen this both in the data center space and I'll say in the EV infrastructure space. There's more willingness to consider creative arrangements like the customer funding or advancing some of the initial engineering work or procurement of long lead materials than there has been in the past. And we've been able to work through that on a kind of custom one-off basis. We want to find a way to make that repeatable. So those are some of the things that are definitely on our mind. And then I'd come back to this notion of the cluster study, where our ability to improve system planning and network modeling, and again, not just study one-off. Okay, if AI data center X wants to locate right here, what are the implications? But then I get another application the next week and I have to start the whole machine all over again. Right now, what we're doing is solving that by just studying multiple applications simultaneously. That's still a somewhat static view. And so I think as an industry, and this is a conversation we have with, partners, other peer utilities and folks like EPRI and whatnot, is how do we create a more dynamic system modeling capability so we can look at system protection, we can look at the loads, we can do that in a manner that's just much more expeditious and be able to again give the engineering green light to these projects earlier on.
I love the idea of that open collaboration and offering alternative options to these data center developers to utilize those underutilized areas of the grid. I think that makes a ton of sense, and really gets back to the Patty Poppy era, at PG&E has very much been an acknowledgement of here's where we came from post wildfires, and now much more transparency and open door, and here's what we're dealing with. And I think that's reflected in that you do an innovation summit at all in telling the industry we have these gaps, we have these needs. So I think that's fascinating. Curious, if internally, have you had to staff up new teams just to exclusively focus on these large scale energy users, data center applications, or is this ran through your traditional energization, interconnection framework?
We've been shifting resources and structuring things a little differently, John, to get at the need. That kind of what I call that consultative engineering, or in other industries you might call pre-sales engineering. And it's funny in the utility business, say it's a pre-sale. It's like, yeah, it is a sale, right? We're trying to close a sale to get a data center developer so
they don't go to Virginia.
Yeah, but ramping up that type of capability and having some more dedicated capability there is a focal point. I would say we're early on. I do think about in software, there's the concept of the 10x or 100x engineer, right? That the best software developers 10x, 20x, 50x, 100x more productive than the average. Now, we've got amazing engineering talent at PG&E. I mean, one of the greatest, and talent broadly. That was one of the things that really was, I'll say, a pleasant surprise for me coming here, just given all of the events the company had been through, was just how much great talent chooses to be at PG&E to make a difference. Every utility has, that sense of duty and service, but this place is special in that way. And so one of the things that's on my mind is, how do we, from a tools perspective and a process perspective, stop holding back our 10x or 100x engineers, and get low value added work off their plates so that they can be spending time in that, consultation with a large data center load. But we are investing some, I would say, some new capability there from an engineering perspective. We also have a dedicated team focused specifically on that South Bay area and San Jose and the surrounding areas. San Jose in particular is really an epicenter for a lot of this activity for a whole bunch of reasons. And so we're working in close partnership with the city and a number of partners there to really, and as you know, the Innovation Summit will be hosted in San Jose. We've really directed attention and energy there to make sure that we've got the right focus. So yeah, we are making some adjustments to beef up our focus in this area.
I only got a few more minutes with you, so I want to be quick and won't spend too much more time on tariff design. But you mentioned that, and I do think it's an important aspect of all of this. And utilities are taking different approaches here. AAP Ohio, I think, did a 10-year take-or-pay environment that I don't think the data centers are too fond of, having to pay essentially 90% of the monthly bill over the course of a decade for this commitment of power. Duke Energy went a different direction, working directly with the Googles, Microsofts, and Amazons of the world to allow them to direct their spend directly toward clean energy and renewable resources, which is kind of a kill two birds with one stone opportunity. What do you think is the right approach to that tariff design to make sure that it is still equitable for the rest of the base, and that you're meeting your system needs, all those different kinds of elements that are at play here?
Yeah, I would say, John, what it's interesting. The Duke, and I have a lot of friends at Duke. I have a ton of respect for that company.
I'm one of their customers.
There we go. I think one thing that's interesting, if you think about our service area and you think about the portion of electrons. I mean, the electrons that we've delivered last year to our bundled customers were effectively 100% greenhouse gas free. And, the CAISO overall is, relatively speaking, pretty clean and carbon free. And so it's an interesting dynamic where, from a starting point, if you hook up in California, you're starting with, pretty green energy. So I don't know about that dynamic, that type of, model for us. I will say that we're in the early stages of designing what we think the right tariff structure could or should be. We're going to study examples from everywhere we can. I do think there's some of the things that I mentioned earlier where, really part of what we're trying to do when you think about any large scale infrastructure project, the greatest risk is always in the development phase, right? Everyone's trying to de-risk the development phase. And some of the things that will really help with de-risking the development phase are things I was mentioning in terms of collaborative conversation about, siting from a land or electrical perspective, the ability to start ordering long lead materials. If you need a 230 kV or 500 kV breaker, those are multi-year and very significant investments. The ability to get the engineering studies done. So part of what we're going to try and work through is how do we put in place and codify some economics around those types of things that we think can really speed up the process, is where our focus and energy is going to be. I think it will probably maybe be less in, well, we'll see. I don't want to, get ahead of ourselves. We're working through it, but we've identified where we see some of those issues, early in the process. We know that it's only fair that, a large load with strong economics on there. And if there's system and network upgrades that are attributable, to that customer, that they should pay for it or pay their share of it. And so we're going to be really laser focused there. We think there's a way to do that makes sense for those data center developer and operators economics, and that makes sense for our customers. One of the data points we shared in our investor update in June was, we think on average 1,000 megawatts of data center load can provide an annual broad customer bill benefit of 1% to 2% savings. That's 1,000 megawatts. And, already over the next few years, we've got 3,500 megawatts, 3,500 megawatts in the queue. So we're optimistic about that. And then we're going to try and work, as I say, design collaboratively a tariff offering that addresses some of those process pain points and ensures that we can realize those economic benefits for all.
This has been great, Jason. I could talk about this with you for hours. Help me land the plane here. What should be the story that folks on the outside read into with the relationship between data centers, utilities, and the grid? Is it as positive? Obviously, you guys see it as this great opportunity. Do you think that's shared throughout the industry? And what should be the takeaway here as we all kind of try to grapple with what you described as this new phenomenon? We're not used to this load growth and rapid load growth story.
Yeah, I think, I will say we talked earlier about my background. I'm definitely I'm a student of the industry. And, if you look back over the years, every 5 to 10 years, there's something thematic that it is very real, but then gets kind of a lot of extra noise around it. In the 50s, it was nuclear energy is going to make it too cheap to meter, right? And in the mid early aughts, we thought that natural gas was going to be $20 forever, and then we had the DG death spiral, right? And within each of those, there's kernels of change and evolution that are very real. And so I think, as you said, there's a lot of hype and energy and excitement and rhetoric around data centers. I think it is quite real. And part of why there's so much excitement and maybe some anxiety is it's a microcosm that's right in front of us of a lot of the challenges and opportunities that we have to work through as we move towards, a more resilient, decarbonized grid that is handling 70, 80, 90, 100% more load. And those are problems that we don't yet have all the answers to. But we're also an industry that has done a pretty darn good job over our history of bringing engineering prowess and creative financing and new technology and innovation to work our way through those problems. And so that's part of why we're optimists is, if you look at the history of the industry, like there is no problem that we cannot solve. And so that's how we're thinking about it. And as I say, what a blessing to have all this demand for our product.
Well said. Jason Glickman, PG&E, thanks so much for joining me today. It was great talking to you.
All right. Thank you, John. Appreciate it.